Our text tonight is going to come from John chapter 10, but that's not going to be the first place that I'm going to ask you to turn. So if you want to open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 1, that will be the first place that we start to look at. Excuse me. So, 3 things intersected for me this week. And I'm not completely sure that this lesson really falls into the flow of our studies out of the Gospel of John, but there's something that happens in the Gospel of John that really made me think a lot about what has been happening around us. And so I want to tell you about these 3 things. There's 2 outside of the Gospel of John that start us. The first thing is people often refer to this in the Gospel of Mark, in our daily Bible readings. They will refer to it as the Messianic secret. And every year, no matter where the Gospel of Mark falls in our reading, there's always questions that I just expect to get. Somebody's going to text me, and this is one of them. And it's a good question. It's weird. It's weird that it happens. The question is something like this: Why does Jesus do miracles and he's acknowledged by spiritual beings, demons? He does miracles, he heals people, and he does all kinds of other things. And even he's confessed by his disciples in the Gospel of, I guess it is in the Gospel of Mark also, when they say, "You're the Christ." And Jesus says, "Now don't tell anybody about this." There's a couple of them. I'll just show you here for the very first one. I'm looking at Mark chapter 1. I guess starting in about verse 24, this is where there's an unclean spirit in a man, and this demon, unclean spirit, says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And so this is, I guess this one is not really hard to figure out, because I don't think that I want my publicity coming from demons either. But the whole, "Hey, Jesus, you are the Holy One of God," like that's kind of the whole point of the Gospels, is to lead us to this truth and to teach us this thing. And so here's our first one in verse 25. "But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent.'" Jump down in chapter 1, there's another one. In verse 33, "The whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him." There's a man with leprosy. In verse 42, "Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once. And he said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest.'" And so the first question is always going to be something kind of like, this is what I think. I think the whole point of the gospel, the whole point of us knowing who Jesus is in the gospel, is to proclaim it. It's good news. And so we share it, and we want to tell people about this thing that we know about Jesus. And so it really is very weird. It's very awkward that Jesus, when people see who he is and they figure it out, that Jesus would say, "Now don't say anything about this." That's weird. And people always have questions about that. And so that's number one. I was telling you 3 things intersect. Number 1 is this. We did our Gospel of Mark in the daily Bible reading, and I'm texting lots of people talking about this all week long. Number 2, on Wednesday night in Ryan's class about creeds, he's starting talking about creeds, and this is a big book. It really is. There's a lot of stuff in this book. And it's not all easy either. If we just acknowledge, like, this is a big book, there's a lot of stuff, and a lot of this stuff is hard. And so I wrote something down that Ryan said in class on Wednesday night when we were talking about Acts chapter 15. The question in Acts chapter 15 is, do Gentiles have to become and live as Jews in order to be Christians? And so we've got this question, and it's the apostles in Jerusalem, the elders in Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas and all of these people were all coming together to see if we can figure out an answer to this question. What are we going to do with these Gentiles? And I wrote this down when Ryan said this. He said, why not just tell us plainly? I mean, you know that God is capable of anything. And I would think, not that, my opinion or my way of operating is good or, the best or by any stretch of anybody's imagination, but it sure would fix a lot of my problems. It would fix a lot of our problems if a voice from heaven would say, this is the answer. And then you could just know. And especially like in this New Testament church setting, this is a really big question, and there's lots of lives and history involved in this whole thing. And so Ryan asked this question. I thought that was a really good question. Why not just say it plainly, especially since the apostles and the prophets are all there? And then you think about the method. I mean, think about the method that God has given us in Ryan's class on creeds. So we figure this thing out. And the way that we figure it out is by saying, well, God said this here, and then he said this here, and then he said this thing about how Edom would come to him. But you got to know from this chapter that Edom refers to the nations and to Gentiles. And so the answer is not because there is some verse somewhere that says this is the answer. The answer is a comprehensive knowledge of this whole thing that's like, who has the time for that? Like, that's a lot. And your question, why not just say it plainly, is the thing. So two things converging at that point. This messianic secret. Why doesn't Jesus just say who he is? Why does he tell people not to say who he is? And the way that God works and the way that we know about his will and all of this, it's complicated. It is. It's difficult. So these two things are happening in my brain this week. You're now in my brain and where my brain is. And I come to my text. I'm going to go to John chapter 10. I come to my text, and this is our next section in the Gospel of John. And this is what I read. With these two things in my brain, this is what I read. John chapter 10, starting in verse 22. At that time, the feast... hold on. It went down the wrong pipe. Sorry about that. Verse 22. At that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." That verse, I read that verse with these other two things in my head this week, and I think, here are the Jewish leaders who come up to Jesus and they say to him, "Can you just say it? Can you just give us an answer here?" And what I want to do, I want to look at some other things. I want to look at a couple other things, because if you keep on reading, in verse 25, Jesus' response to them is, "I did already." He says, "I told you, and you do not believe." But, there's a little bit more to it than Jesus just saying, I told you, because what they want the same thing from Jesus that was happening in the situation with the Messianic secret. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. There is zero question in that sentence. I want Jesus to say, that's me. I am the Holy One of God. All my problems are solved. Because he just said the words, or your thing that you said. Can you just make it plain? Like, that's what they're asking. Can you just say the words? And look at, he said, I have told you the answer. Look at how he told us the answer. In John chapter 4, these two don't really count. I thought that we should definitely read them because they have to do with what we're talking about right now. But this is not something that Jesus said to these Jewish leaders who are asking this question right now. In John chapter 4 and verses 25 and 26, this is Jesus and his interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. I'm just going to start in verse 25. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. And when he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. So there you go. That's about as clear as it gets. Although that's not Jesus saying the words, I am the Christ, but she says, I know that there's a Messiah and a Christ, and Jesus says the person that you're talking to is him, the Christ. So there you go. That's pretty clear. In John chapter 9 and verse 35 through 38, John chapter 9 is the chapter where Jesus heals a man who was born blind. And this is the end of that section. In John chapter 9, starting in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered and said, Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And the man said, Lord. That when he throws the word Lord in there, it's like, okay, now he gets it. He says, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. And so that's pretty clear, but again, that was not to the Jewish leaders who are asking the question, and they say, just give us an answer. Tell us plainly, who are you? Look back at John chapter 5. This is what Jesus says they should have been able to understand. In John chapter 5, I'm going to read verses 16 through 18. Jesus says, this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, My Father is working until now, and I am working. And then in verse 18 it says, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And so, here's something that I've got 3 things for you today. We're plugging data into our brains right now before we get to those 3 things. But here's something that I think we should consider. Jesus makes this statement, My Father is working until now, and I am working. And he doesn't say plainly the thing that they want him to say, but they knew exactly what he was saying. The text tells us they knew exactly what he was saying, and this is the reason why they were going to try to kill him anyway. But these are the kinds of things, Jesus has been walking around their territory now for a long time, saying stuff like, my Father is working until now, and I am working. And they finally confront him face to face, and they say, just say it. Tell us plainly the thing. Look at chapter 5 and verse 36. John chapter 5 and verse 36, the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. So Jesus says to this group of people, you should be able to see what's happening right now and to know the answer to this question. Jesus finally says, in our text in John chapter 10, Jesus says, I did tell you plainly, and you do not believe. And this is his answer. He says, the works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you don't believe. They said, just tell us plainly. And Jesus' response is something like this. No. You should be able to figure it out yourself. That's it. That's not me making some giant stretch on what the text is. He refers to his works, and his response is, no, I'm not going to tell you plainly. You should be able, with the eyes in your head, in the brain in your noggin, to figure out the answer to your question. But still, isn't it interesting that Jesus just doesn't say it the way that I would like him to say it? There's one more, and then I think I'll get to you. John chapter 8. John chapter 8, verse 57. John chapter 8, verses 57 to 59. This is another one of those ones where Jesus doesn't say directly what they want him to say, but they knew exactly what he was saying. Starting in verse 57. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So Jesus' answer to them is, I am. And you would say, oh, that sounds an awful lot like what the burning bush said to Moses. And that's they knew it, verse 59. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. They knew exactly what he was saying. That's the reason why they were going to try and kill him. And so, why not just say it plainly? Three things intersecting, all in my brain in 1 week. Why not just say it plainly? And so that's the question that I've tried to at least think through some answers on. And it's not just, well, here's the answer to these questions, but what am I going to take away from it personally? How is this going to change me tomorrow? Number one, I like this a lot. I like this a whole lot. I like that Jesus doesn't give them what they want, because Jesus is in control and Jesus is the one who sets the narrative. I said something about this on the internet a couple of days ago because I was working on this point. Every week you'll see this on the internet, whether it's social media or your news feed. I have everything that I want to see lined up in Google News, and so I just roll through Google News and it pulls all these things together, and I'm scrolling through, and every week there's always a thing. You know what I'm talking about? It's always a thing. Whatever is the thing is what everybody is talking about. And nobody can do anything else except for that thing this week. That's the narrative. That's what we're talking about. And I cannot tell you how much I love this, that the religious leaders of the day, the guys who set the narrative, come up to Jesus and they say it. Tell us plainly. And Jesus' response is something like this. No. I mean, what he says is, I have told you. Look at the works that I did. His response is something like, figure it out for yourself. But no. And the thing that he does is he says, I'm not playing your games. That I think, if you go to Mark chapter 14, that I think shows us something about Jesus. I'm back to the messianic secret right now. Jesus goes around saying, He heals people, he casts out demons, and he says, don't say anything about it. And this is the response. If you say, hey, Ryan, what's going on here? Why is this? My response is going to be something like this. Because Jesus wanted to be in control of the way that everything went down. And not only how it went down, but when it went down. And so what you see in Mark chapter 14, in my Bible, what I wrote was, I write MS, that's Messianic Secret, and the Messianic Secret here in Mark 14 is finally revealed. This is the spot where it finally comes out. They say this question to him in verse 61. He remained silent, made no answer, and again the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Here is the thing. Say it. Answer the question. In verse 62, Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So it's like, I'm going to answer your question, and I'm really going to make you mad with the next thing that I'm going to say. And he just kind of lathers it up. And so he answers their question. And look, keep on going to verse 63. Look what happens now. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. And here we are in the chapters now where Jesus is crucified. But here's the cool thing about this, what I love so much about this. Jesus chose the when and the where and the how. They were asking up to this point, tell us, say it plainly, give us what we want. And he waited until he was ready, until the time had come. In the Gospel of John, this is the way that you read about this. Look at John chapter 2. The way that you see it in the Gospel of John is these words, my hour has not yet come. The Gospel of John is filled with Jesus saying, it's not time for that yet. And so in John chapter 2 and verse 4, this is when Jesus turns water into wine. And Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. It's not time for me to do this yet. John chapter 7 and verse 30. John chapter 7 and verse 30. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. They couldn't arrest him because it wasn't time for him to be arrested yet. And then chapter 8 and verse 20. In John chapter 8 and verse 20. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. And then we finally come over to John chapter 12. And this is what you see. This is the turning point in the book. John chapter 12 and verse 23. Jesus answered, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. So, it's questions. Why doesn't Jesus just say it plainly? And at least one answer to that question is because both God the Father and Jesus are in total control of the situation. Nothing in the Scripture happens to Jesus. He happens to them. Whenever he's ready, that's when we're going to do it. And it's not like, oh no, they arrested Jesus. Now they're going to crucify him. Oh no, they got him. They do it because it was time for it to happen and Jesus was ready for that to happen. And all of that is summarized in this little sentence. Jesus sets the narrative. Things don't happen to him. He happens to other people. And my takeaway from that, the thing that I wrote on the internet, is something that I would like for us, instead of just hopping on the bus and riding along with whatever the narrative is going to be this week, and everybody's going to be doing, and everybody's going to be talking about, how about this? How about we let God set the narrative? and we talk about the things that God is talking about, and we do the things that God is doing, instead of letting the world be in control of our lives and where we go and when we go and how we do everything, no. Jesus sets the narrative. That's point number one. I would say it like this. Why not just tell us plainly? I'll tell you plainly when I'm ready to tell you plainly. That's Jesus sets the narrative. Number two. This one's kind of sad. Why don't you just tell us plainly? And Jesus' response is, it's not like it would matter anyway. He says, let's go back to our text in John chapter 10. I want to read the whole section here in verse 24. How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. And Jesus answered, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe, because you are not among my sheep. And so his response here, listen to this. This is from a commentary. This is from D.A. Carson's commentary on this verse that we're talking about right now. The Jews are not seeking for clarity in order to worship him without restraint. They're not saying, tell us plainly who you are, because if you tell us that you're the Christ, then we're going to believe you and follow you. That's not what's going on here. Rather, they want to obtain from him an unambiguous statement that would provide an adequate basis for their attack. Look at Luke 22 with me. In Luke chapter 22, this is one of the clearest places that I could find that talks about this concept. Luke 22, in verses 66 and 67. Luke 22, starting in verse 66, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. So, tell us plainly so that we can know. And Jesus' response is, it's not like it's going to matter. So I'm trying to take things away from this. What does this teach me? And the first thing that I take away from this is, I don't want to be that guy. I've seen that guy. And I'll tell you this at the very start, nobody in this room knows the person I'm talking about. So don't sit here and try and figure out, oh, hey, who's that? You don't know him. You just don't. There's no reason why anybody would know this guy. But there was a guy a long time ago whose life was just a disaster. Every single thing about this guy's life was a disaster. And he came to us good, and he says, I believe the gospel, I believe in Jesus, I'm ready to be a Christian. He comes to us, he becomes a Christian, everything's great. But his life is still a disaster. Just because he was baptized doesn't mean, he's got all of his ducks in a row now. And I think the first thing that happened with this guy was probably his money. And he said, can you help me with my money? Just imagine the worst financial situation that you've ever imagined in your entire life, and then times 1,000. That's what he had got himself into. And so we sat down with him and we said, okay, this is what... If you're in a bad spot, this is always the answer. There's always a way out. There always is a way out. So don't feel like it's hopeless, because it's not. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be a long and miserable road, but here we go. We're going to get out of this. And it had to have been like 20 minutes. And I'm telling you, this is the only possible thing that could have been going through his head. Every single thing that Ryan said, I'm going to do the opposite. And it's like, here's how we're going to get out of this. We're going to do this. And he said, okay, I'm going to do this instead. It's like, okay, we're going to do this. He said, okay, I'm going to do this instead. Everything. And I think when I'm reading this story about these people, this is the person that I think of. I'm not going to tell you the whole gory details of this, but he found a wife at a club while she was working. And so we said, hey, this is not a good idea. So he marries her. And then that goes bad. Shocker. And so, okay, here's what we're going to do. And it's like every single thing along the way, it didn't matter what anybody said. He was going to do what he was going to do, and that was it. And that's the kind of people that we're reading about here in the Gospel of John. When they come up to Jesus and they say, just tell us plainly who you are. And Jesus' response is, what difference would it make? You're going to do whatever you want to do anyway. You're not going to listen to anything or anyone. You're just going to do the stuff that you want to do. And so lesson number one, obviously on the scale of the illustration that I gave just a second ago, don't do that. But don't be that guy. Don't be the person who says, this is what I think and this is what I'm going to do and nobody can change my mind no matter what. This is where I'm going and that's just it. Don't be that guy. We learn a lesson from these people. Don't be that guy. But number two, look at Matthew 7. You can see that Jesus says something about this. In Matthew chapter 7, I'm going to start reading at the end of the section where Jesus says the thing about take the log out of your own eye first so that you can help the person get the speck out of their eye. And he ends with this in verse 5. Take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. And what he's saying, in the first part of that, in chapter 7 and verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. He's not saying don't help people get the speck out of their eye. We're supposed to do that. He's just saying don't be a hypocrite when you're walking around with a giant log sticking out of your eye. Fix yourself and then go and help other people. And so here's this story about helping your brother get the speck out of his eye. But then look at the very next thing that he says in verse 6. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn and attack you. And so here's this context about helping your brother get the speck out of his own eye. And the very next thing that Jesus says is, there are some people who are just not going to hear what you have to say. And Jesus specifically tells them in this situation, don't give to dogs what is holy. Don't take your pearls, this good stuff, and set them down before pigs. In other places in the gospel, Jesus says when you go somewhere and it becomes apparent that these people are just not going to hear what you have to say, he says wipe the dust off your feet and keep on moving. Here's something from the Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 9 and verses 7 and 8. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. And the idea here is there are some people who just will not listen. And so my takeaways are, don't be that guy. And also, this is going to be a little harder for me to recognize it when it happens. There's some people who just are not going to listen. And then the last one. This is the last one, and this is the one that I think is my main takeaway. Go over to Mark chapter 4 with me. Why didn't Jesus just say it plainly? And why is there the messianic secret? And why is it that we have this difficult process of going through the whole scripture and trying to figure it out? And I want to read you the last thing. Let me tell you the conclusion before I start trying to make that case. It seems to me that Jesus is looking for people not who know more than everybody else, or who are special or better than everybody else. It's not that they know. That's not the people who Jesus is looking for. He's looking for the people who care enough to come searching for him. That seems to be the definitive quality here. And I want to show you that here. In Mark chapter 4, we're reading the parable of the sower. And so Jesus tells this parable. Some seed's going to land here, some seed's going to land here, and this is what it's all going to do. And then in verse 9, Jesus says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." So he finishes the parable, and he who has ears to hear, let him hear. He's looking out and he says to people, you understand what I'm saying, right? This isn't about seeds and plants. That's he who has ears to hear, let him hear. We're all hearing this, right? In verse 10, when he was alone, those around him, that's the thing I want you to see especially. Those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive." They hear the story of the parable, but they don't understand what's it about. It's about planting seeds and things growing. They don't understand what's going on. They see, but they don't perceive. They hear, but they don't understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. And he said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" And then he goes on to explain it. Now, I want to read this to you. I don't know when I read this first, but this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Jenny asked a question about this last Monday night, and I brought this quote up. It reminded me about this. So listen to this. What is it that makes one an insider over against an outsider? That's the question. From this story, that's what we want to know. I want to be one of the insiders in Jesus' circle, not an outsider. And so this commentary is talking about, what's the difference between the insiders and the outsiders? Listen, the key element that distinguishes one from the other is that the insider gathers around Jesus as an honest inquirer. Listen, this is important. Disciples are no different from anyone in needing explanations for the parables. But they are different from outsiders in that they choose to come to Jesus for explanations. The decisive difference is that insiders are not indifferent. Outsiders simply don't regard what he says to be critical enough to bother joining the disciples around Jesus in order to get answers. And so the thing that I'm taking away from this whole thing is, what makes an insider different from an outsider? It's not that they know more. The disciples come to Jesus, and it's there on the page. They don't have any idea what he's talking about. They come to him with questions. What are you talking about? They don't know. And so the difference between the insider and the outsider is not that the insider knows more, or definitely not that they're better people. It's that they care to come and ask. And so, John chapter 10 and verse 24. Tell us plainly. Tell us. Who are you? Say it. Give us the answer. Just say it so we can all know what it is. They weren't looking for the answer to that question. They were looking for a way to get what they wanted anyway. I'll finish with this. This will be the last thing that I read tonight, and then we'll be done. Matthew chapter 7. I'm going to pick up where we left off. In verse 5, take the speck out of your brother's eye. In verse 6, don't give dogs what is holy. Don't throw your pearls before pigs. But in verse 7, here's what we have. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. Maybe the thing that God is looking for is people who care enough to do those things. Not people who have all the answers. People who care to seek and to knock and to ask. And that has a lot to do with us. We've got this daily Bible reading. I know I'm not just going to keep going on and on and on about it constantly. I might, because it's important. But the daily Bible reading is there. And this week, if you feel tempted to say, okay, I'm behind, it's time to sit down and do my reading, I don't have time for that. I got other things to do. That's not important to me right now. I want you to remember this and to think about the kind of person that Jesus is after is the kind of person who comes to him looking for answers. Not the person who has the answers, the person who comes looking for answers. Jeremiah 29 and verse 13 says this, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." That's what I want to do this week. That's how I want to be changed by this text. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, or maybe you don't know very much about Christianity or about us, maybe you don't know, the thing that I want you to know is not that we're the place who has all the answers, or that we're the place where everybody gets everything right. The thing that I want somebody to know about us is that this is the place where people come together who are looking for those answers and seeking and asking and knocking. That's what this is about. If we can help you to come to God or to make your life right in some way, support you, pray for you, whatever, let us know as we stand and sing the invitation song.